大家好，今天我们来聊聊不去中国怎么学中文。Are any of you TikTok refugees？ 就是 TikTok 在美国被迫暂停服务之后，有好多朋友蜂拥而上，全是中文的小红书。那你们会不会想学一点中文，更方便搜熊猫视频呢？正在求职的朋友们，你们不想在简历上写一句 fluent in Chinese， 忽悠一下雇主？还是有些朋友对中美关系特别感兴趣，想深入研究政治、经济方面的话题？ Now, if you didn't understand a single word that I said earlier, thanks so much for tuning in. I'm here to help you get there. And if you did understand, well, that's where I stop with the Chinese, but I still hope that you keep watching.Because Chinese is probably the most spoken language in the world today. There's so many compelling reasons to learn the language. Does anyone disagree? I'm making this video because I really want to share my experience as a Burmese person who learned Chinese as a foreign language. I'm at a level where I've done professional translations, taught Chinese tuition, made friends, and gotten shopping discounts because I simply know the language. Now, I want to lay out what I had and what I didn't have in my journey. So, I was taught Chinese when I was in Singapore for about 10 years in school. So that's about 5 hours a week. And then I had a little bit of books and TV. I've never traveled to a predominantly Chinese-speaking environment. No one in my family speaks Chinese.I had no friends that spoke to me in Chinese regularly until I was at work. I didn't have free internet exposure until I graduated from high school. So there was virtually no YouTube, no Bilibili where I could watch vloggers like what I'm doing now. I won't deny that taking structured Chinese classes built a very solid foundation, but I was never that confident in using the language in real life.Until I stumbled upon a bunch of resources and taught myself a whole new dimension of the language. So I've tried to connect dots in my journey and condensed it all in this video so that you go about your journey more intentionally than I did. The function of language is communication. Now this means that utility is more important than mastery. Whether you're going to order a bowl of noodles or negotiate a business deal,You need different levels of mastery and vocabulary. You don't need to be perfect. Even for myself, I'm more proficient in Chinese using shows and books instead of the names of vegetables, which I am most proficient in my native Burmese. You don't need to worry about perfect pronunciation either. Many people in China do not speak 普通话, and those that do have so many different accents and pronunciations.Now let's get into the meat of the video. For those of us not living somewhere we can live and hear Chinese, there's a clear lack of need for the language. We don't pay our bills in Chinese, we don't get into a fight in Chinese. This means that it's on us to expose ourselves to the language. The way I see it, we can group exposure into inputs and outputs. The first type of exposure is what I call assisted exposure.Unlike the Roman script or even East Asian languages like Korean or Burmese, you can't spell Chinese. Or can you? Well, you have to memorize a lot of strokes, but the pinyin system lets you spell these characters. So the first suggestion I have is really to read books accompanied with pinyin, which is really essential for beginners who are trying to learn the pronunciations.Well, okay, learning how to make a sound sounds good, but how can we tell the meaning off of the strokes? So that's where we look at the surrounding context. I learned quite a bit of Chinese from watching Digimon. Yeah, it's a Japanese show and I happen to have a Chinese dubbed version of it. So there's this Digimon called Agumon or Yagu Shou, and every time he evolves,He changes his name to 暴龙兽 and then 战斗暴龙兽. Notice the pattern? It always ends in 兽, which literally translates to beast. And the point here is not even to know this translation. It's to naturally relate this word to the idea of a beast or an animal without needing to translate. And that happens just by seeing this guy pop up whenever you hear the sound shou. Because as far as I know, that's how we learned our first languages without having a reference point or a reference language to translate to. So do you notice that Chinese is really a lot about pattern recognition? I'm sure that you'll get the hang of it after watching an entire series of Digimon. Okay, that's it for assisted exposure, but we're not done with reading. Next thing I want to cover is called forced exposure. Basically, you actively choose to engage with Chinese rather than a language that you're used to. And one simple way to do that is to change the entire interface of one of your favorite apps into Chinese. Looking for things to do in New York. Boom. The interface and arrangement is all very familiar. So this random word here has got to be ratings, 评分. This one's got to be time, 时间, results, 结果, right here. Let's hop out, explore other familiar icons like this one. Food places, hotels, public transport, very telling. This trick is effective with apps that you're so familiar with because we don't technically read words when we use them. They're just markers and we click on them as a matter of habit. So just stick to this for a few days and I guarantee that some of these words are going to stick. Forced exposure is really just a way to push yourself out of your comfort zone. Now, if you're up for a challenge, feel free to change your entire OS to Chinese. Just make sure that you have another device in case you get lost in your new, entirely Chinese interface. The next exposure tip is listening. Similar concept, except that we want to train our ears. Again, think of how we first learned our native tongue. Before we learned to read and write, we had to first listen to the sounds that our parents were making, just to find out things like where the food was and when it was time to cry and throw a tantrum. So Chinese shows is something I really swear by. Now this is not as common as in English language shows, but period dramas or 古装剧 are a huge thing in China. Got people dressing up in ancient costumes, flying around, shooting laser beams, or wiping out like 10 people with a bat flip. Parts of the dialogue will use terms you don't ever see in daily life like 阁下 or 本座. But I do notice that the pronunciations are very standardized and the actors use voiceovers, so they are immensely helpful for listening. Now, I don't find news broadcasts particularly helpful for beginners because of the use of 书面语, unlike 口语, which is more like spoken, informal language. 书面语 has a greater density of advanced vocabulary within each sentence. Here's a comparison. 口语版本，跟你工作很开心，但你要被裁了，今晚还得加班。书面语版本，很高兴与您共事，但您将被裁员，今晚请留下来加班。I'm sure that a lot of people in the US market can relate to this, but I digress. These sentences mean the exact same thing and have a similar length, but are written so differently. I personally feel that the difference between formal and informal speech is more stark in Chinese than in English. Now, we're moving on to output exposure. The first form of output I like to share is to read to yourself, 朗读. Chinese is a tonal language. There aren't that many, like just 5, but you have to nail each one so that people understand you. 我想死你 and 我想撕你 are two very different meanings, and you'll get two very different reactions. During my first couple of years learning Chinese, I probably wasn't even 10, I joined a class that made me read 老子, 大学, 中庸. It's like some ancient Chinese book, and I had absolutely no idea what it meant, no interest in the content. Now the cool thing is that it came with a recording that massively helped me familiarize with standard mainland 普通话 pronunciation, which I had never been exposed to anywhere else. Speaking another language is like singing. You need to get used to it, vocalize the words, and figure out the tongue placements. Another way of practicing output is to engage in conversation. Find a friend, a 语伴, who also wants to speak Chinese, and create a low-stakes scenario to practice, to make mistakes, and of course, make fun of each other. 活学活用, learn and apply. Force yourself to make connections between the words in real time. Unlike writing, there's no cut and paste, no editing, which just adds to the challenge. So someone asked me when I was a kid, like, 吃饱了吗? Which just means, have you eaten yet? But I confused 饱 for 包 as in 面包 or 包子, and I said 没有，我吃饭了, which means I ate rice. This is a super common household convo, but just like many of you, no one in my house says this. So you really need to practice outside and sometimes, make a joke out of it. You can also do this in daily life scenarios which require standard conversations, like ordering food in Chinese, in a restaurant, introducing yourself, asking for the food, the restroom, or even the bill if you're trying to impress your date. The final tip is to write. Oh, don't worry, everything's digital. You don't need to hold a pen and memorize the actual Chinese characters. Let's use DeepSeek as a language buddy through text. Assume that I have an idea of how the words look like, but can't remember how to write them from scratch. Well, no worries, because the vast majority of native Chinese use pinyin to type. Now here, I'm telling him that I like to eat and sleep. In my reply, 不知道 here, there's a trick where we can just write the first letter instead of the whole word. So BZD, and you get it. So that was the how on writing, but why should we write? First, the process of making sentences, 造句, when we're not caught up in real-time conversation, gives us time to think through vocabulary and phrasing. If you'd like to comment on this video and say, hey, this guy is so long-winded, and you went, 这家伙好, and you realize you don't know how to say long-winded, you can look it up and save the word 啰嗦 in your personal dictionary, and you'll remember it. Since we're learning Chinese as an addition to other languages, this naturally forces us to do translation or 翻译. We're just trying to express the same thoughts in a different language. If you can't be bothered to create new sentences for the sake of it, you could simply translate existing material like your favorite song, your diary, or boilerplate language in your internet contract. Or maybe not that one. Chinese is difficult. We've got to put in the hours, memorize thousands of words, and we don't have time. I cook, clean, pay taxes on top of a day job. But it unlocks an entire world of knowledge, people, and places to go to. Now imagine what you'd be missing out on if you didn't know English. That's how I feel after learning Chinese. I hope this video provided a framework for you to organize your efforts in climbing this mountain. 每一步都是进步。我们下一期视频见，加油！